My name is Scott Schafer. This is my second time presenting at 3 Grey Thumb meetings. It's not that I really like talking in front of large groups, I really love this conversation. So what I'm presenting today is an architecture which is sort of in the proof of concept and design phase for artificial life development. It's an outgrowth of some earlier work that I've done. And I'm presenting it hopefully to get some feedback and that the ideas that I put out might crossbreed and evolve in your minds. And if it goes extinct, I'm okay with that too. So this is a little biographical sketch of what I've been doing for the past 16 years, which is working as the lead architect, designer, and programmer of a system that allows users, many with special needs, severe physical disabilities, cognitive impairments, visual impairments, and some regular able-bodied kids to use, well, it's a multi-platform system and allows them to use the computer as a creativity tool to access curriculum and so on. So many different ways of inputs to get to the same kind of thing on a variety of platforms. And I've also had an interest in artificial life, just on my own, not really realizing that there was this great community out here, just kind of coming up to speed on the history. But my 2 projects, which I demonstrated earlier, are Macro Pond 1 and 2, in which basically the critters are worm-like. They have a series of instructions that guides their behavior, and they compete for food. In Micro Pond 2, the critters can prey upon each other. In fact, there is no external food. There's just critters. And they can photosynthesize, and the photosynthesizing makes them vulnerable to being eaten. And then I've also been working on a stock trading program with evolving rules that hopefully will make me hundreds of dollars. Hopefully it'll be a better trader than me, which won't be hard. So VATLife. So the origin of VATLife is along the way, when I was developing MicroPond 2, I thought to maybe make it a useful tool as opposed to just a fun thing where you watch worms crawl around and eat each other. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to make this a sort of test bed for evolvable virtual machines? And at some point, I kind of realized that maybe not, that the environment of MicroPond 2 might not be the best place for that, because it seemed like there were simple solutions that didn't really require that much intelligence. And so you might develop the perfect evolvable virtual machine that could solve all kinds of problems. You put it in there, and it really doesn't have much to do. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's true. Maybe given enough time, behaviors would emerge. So the second thought that's kind of rattling in my brain is there's a theory that a single-celled life first evolved on Mars. It got knocked off into space, came here on a chunk of ice, and it flourished on Earth. So the analogy there is the initial Martian environment that wasn't really sustainable for these organisms. Eventually, they would have gone extinct there, but they got transported to another environment where they flourished. So got me thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we had many different environments and the creatures could migrate between them? And if this sounds a lot like the Evo grid, it definitely was inspired by hearing about the Evo grid. And in some ways, what I'm presenting is just sort of a nuts and bolts approach to how you might accomplish some goals of the Evo grid. And Tom Barbalet mentioned this idea of islands on the Evo grid, where you might have different environments that were similar. And so I'm thinking, yeah, this might be a design for a number of islands, similar environments, or kind of disparate environments. Yeah, so one kind of metaphor. So basically what I wanted to do, again, I was thinking MicroPond is potentially a test bed for evolvable virtual machines, but maybe it's not the best environment. Maybe I want to create virtual machines that can go in a number of different environments, and and have an environment that could host many different types of virtual machines. So basically, we need an abstraction layer between the virtual machine and the environment. So that way you can, plug and play. And an example, actually inspired by Al, who mentioned at the end of our first meeting that, well, perhaps all reality is virtual. And that reminded me of this brain in the vat idea, which is kind of an ancient idea, goes back way before computers, but it applies well, and it was made really popular by The Matrix. But basically the idea is you got the brain, the controller, and it doesn't really directly interact with its environment. The environment is simulated. You might have some lines, and that's basically the philosophical idea is, well, what if reality is an illusion? What if everything that we perceive is generated? Originally, the idea was by some demon who's entrancing us. This is kind of a nice metaphor in two ways. One is the brain doesn't really directly interact with its environment. It uses a set of signals, inputs and outputs, so you can connect it to any type of simulation. But also the simulation doesn't really have to know about the brain. So you could have different types of brains. All right. So this is an image that I swiped from Wikipedia. And in this example, 3 lines are enough to simulate all of reality, which I think is a little simplistic. But just to keep the illustration here. So we might have basically each line being an input and an output, and the brain can send a signal to control the simulated legs. It might receive a signal that informs the brain that, okay, there's warmth on the leg. So in this simulation, the brain is thinking, I'm walking outside in the sun. So, all right, so normally this is kind of a sinister proposition, but being that we're kind of mad scientists here, let's just get our hands wet. So the simulation, it's maintaining the state of objects that this virtual body is interacting with, for example, the sun. It's maintaining information about the physical body attached to the brain, which you could call the phenotype of this organism. Incorporating the brain's outputs into the simulation, generating new inputs, and it's also going to be simulating the aging, reproduction, death of the body, because none of that really exists. And of course, we're not talking about an actual brain here, it's just kind of a metaphor. So we can link up multiple brains, they can interact with each other. So each of these brains has a virtual body. Each of the virtual bodies may see the other virtual bodies in the simulation, which is much like Second Life, actually. So the brains can be, as I mentioned, they can be polymorphous. The simulation just knows about inputs and outputs. It doesn't really need to know what's on the other end. So you've got 2 black boxes talking to each other through kind of well-defined inputs and outputs. So, and as I said, the simulations can be polymorphous too. So you take the same brain, connect the wires to another simulation. Now you're not a human being walking in the sun. You're swimming in the ocean and you're enormous, eating krill. Okay, and because there's this very well-defined interface between the simulated organisms and their environments, and it's very generic, you can easily migrate these different VATLifes between one simulation and the other. The topmost simulation is basically your 3D physics kind of simulation. You're operating a simulated body, walking outside. The bottom one would be, well, it's a simulation I hope to write, which is very simplistic. The idea is that the artificial life organisms are asked to predict the next number in a sequence, and they're rewarded on how well they do that. So very simple, but potentially just enormously powerful. And the idea is that, perhaps, I'm not sure how well this would work in theory, in practice, but theoretically, you could have one type of evolvable controller that might do well in either environment. I was in communication with a guy in the Netherlands who he wants to train computers to speak in some way, or he wants the fitness function to be how well they can read text aloud, which is fairly ambitious. But he's been kind of looking for different types of evolvable controllers. He was looking at neural nets, the nuance engine, and so on. And it just really struck me, well, why should he have to worry about that? I mean, his real task there is building the simulation, building the fitness function. That's the big challenge. And so he could just develop the environment, not worry about the controller. Or conversely, say your goal is to create this evolvable virtual machine that's capable of developing intelligence. Well, you create it, you can put it in many different environments. Maybe it's going to find an environment which it does really well in. And on that second node, you can have a single environment, and you can have many different types of evolvable machines, neural nets, nuance engine, what have you, and you can have them compete. I'm going to show a simple proof of concept showing that. So yeah. So the I/O pins that's the interface between the artificial life forms and the environment. And the model I'm using for that is the nervous system. So you've got kind of a spinal cord, and it branches out, and you can write to it, you can read from it. So it's branching. So that's the basic idea, is that you've got a central pin, which can have child pins. You can talk to them. They can talk back. They need to be, skipping to the bottom, you need to be able to attach code to changes in the inputs. So we have neurons that fire when a light goes on, when they detect a change in the condition. That sends off a series of events. So we need to be able to do that with our code. So, and in hardware, we often have interrupt processors, so it's a good design pattern. So, all right. So within this architecture, there's basically three kind of unique entities. There's the environment, and there's a base environment, which has some base functionality. I'm going to get into programmerese in a bit, so I apologize to the non-programmers in the audience. But you've got, so the base environment, you get it from VATLife. You can extend it. You can add your own rules of physics, your own fitness function. And I've tried to design this to accommodate as many different types of environments as possible. And I don't know if that really is possible. I think there are some types, like cellular automata, I don't think are really going to work in this system. But I'd like it to be able to support the 3D physics simulations, predict the next number in the sequence, also just a wide range. And what I would like to hear from people, particularly the programmers to whom this sounds like an interesting framework from which to base your project, what would be useful to you, or what limitations do you see in this? But in any case, so the environment, you provide the fitness function, you provide the inputs and outputs for each A-life. So A-life number 200 wants to write something to a particular I/O pin. You have to figure out how to handle that. And so, the environment needs to generate the initial phenotype, the form of each creature from its genotype. So the idea is basically a new artificial life form comes into the environment. It has a genotype, which is basically just a long string, has separators to indicate gene sequences and so on. But the phenotype the environment is responsible for taking that genotype and creating an initial form. And then we have the controller, which generates a mind, essentially a series of instructions or a neural net, or whatever type of data it needs to provide a critter to know how to process its inputs and outputs. And then the controller is responsible for processing the mind against the environment. So, and then the artificial life form really doesn't contain very much. It has data, including its genotype, its phenotype, both of which are a black box. Each artificial life form is only going to interact with its environment through the controller, which is going to make requests to the environment. And each artificial life form will have a reference to the appropriate controller. So the idea there is that you might have one artificial life form that uses, say, the nuance engine. It's maybe you aren't familiar with that. It's basically, someone has created a nice virtual machine. It has a nice instruction set. It's designed to mutate well. So you can make random changes to it, and it's not going to break, and it's going to do some interesting things. It's designed to evolve. So you have your particular environment full of your artificial life forms using one set of controllers. One comes in from somewhere else off the internet. It may bring its own controller with it. So that's the reference. So okay. So in our normal growth, biological growth, or plant growth, let's take plant growth. You start with a seed, it sprouts, 2 leaves, and so on. So it doesn't arrive with its own phenotype. It has to direct its own development, and that's contained within the code. So the problem here that I was faced with was something like Darwin bots, in which you have creatures that, any of you seen Darwin bots? It's similar to Carl Sims creatures. Basically, the idea is you got these 3D entities, and they may look like snakes or gorillas and whatnot, and they evolve over time, and they have emotion, and their fitness function is how well they are at moving across a plane. So what these creatures are about is primarily about their phenotype, their form, and their motion, how well they interacts. And so within this VATLife, it's a little tricky, because if you bring in a VATLife creature and it has a genotype, the environment can sort of create that creature according to its genotype. The environment, the Darwin bot's environment, knows how to produce a gorilla kind of thing. But that's really not going to translate so well to another environment. So I think I'm getting too detailed here, actually. I'm going to skip ahead.
Excuse me.
Yes?
One step back, with the worm type element evolving to respond to the immediate environment. One of the most logical applications are like sending to Mars, moving around and see how it reacts to whatever environment, and either communicate back or literally build those genes or items that allow him to evolve on the spot and move on. And motion is not necessarily the first consideration. Probably with chemistry, biology, and evolution, almost instantaneous. I wonder if an application like that could be almost ideal for this basic sequence ready to mute, to transform whatever the environment is calling for, and we don't know. That's the point. So we have to do an awful lot of research beforehand, and then just send these, see how it evolves, and from there, continuing on those tracks.
Sure. Well, I'll just say to that, you'd need to have a really good simulation to make that happen, particularly if you wanted to artificially evolve creatures which could self-replicate in the real world. And I think it's a great goal, and I'd love for this to be a flexible enough platform to support that. My primary interest is in evolutionary computation. So for me, the fact that it exists in the real world or not, it's not necessarily the key for me. I think that there are a lot of great problems that just can be solved without anything in the real world actually ever having to exist. And use a lot less material, too, when you're just simulating these things and you just throw them out and there's no waste. Yeah?
How do you keep consistency in such system? So you have your creature and you transfer it to another place. Do you keep a copy on your island? Does it transfer it, or?
My thought is, my thought is that that really a creature doesn't actually move from one to another, but that its genetic information and its controller can enter another environment. I mean, you could have literally the same creature. You could try to have the same creature move.
A new creature based on your character on another island.
Right.
And how do you control spamming or getting some creatures that can destroy all your...
Okay, well, I think this is actually a key difference from VATLife and the EvoGrid as I understand it, which I don't claim to. But my understanding is that with the EvoGrid, at least there was some discussion of having one creature from another environment say, tell another creature in another environment, I've eaten you. And then that, the other environment would be expected to kill off that creature. And so what I'm proposing basically, it's an environment is a level playing field. That doesn't happen. When a creature goes from environment A to environment B, it has to conform with all the same rules of environment B that all the creatures living there do. Does that answer your question?
No, because if my environment says, okay, we have food, you can eat the food, and food controls how much you can populate or survive. And I'm getting a new creature that eats all the food.
Well, I would just consider that to be like an invasive species coming to California and doing really well here. And while that's really bad from an environmental perspective, from an evolutionary perspective, it's not bad, in a sense.
Can you roll back?
It's really not that well developed. Like I said, we're still in the proof of concept stage, and I'm pretty close to showing off an early demonstration.
When you say the rules are different among environments, I have to question how different are they? Is it like one environment might be 70 degrees and one environment might be 71 degrees? Or is it like Earth and Mars? Oxygen here, vacuum there. Because if it's oxygen here, vacuum there, like you won't be able to have any migration at all. Because as soon as an organism goes from one environment to the other, it'll just die.
Right. And it's a real possibility. And I mean, I used Mars before as kind of a metaphor because I'm not really thinking, at least at this stage, of a real physical simulation. But I think you're right. And one answer to that might be you might have 100 different environments, and they might be, the two extremes might be very different from each other, but there might be environments in between where you might be able to have some migration. And then the whole thing might not work at all. You might be right. But you don't know.
Well,
I think we're going to be getting to a bigger discussion.
Yeah.
Later.
Okay.
We probably should.
Right.
Scott get through the...
Yeah, I think this is maybe the last slide. So I've been developing in Java. I've been kind of a C++ guy. And actually, this is my first Java program ever. So, take bear that in mind. But when you're doing C++, you got to figure out, okay, what kind of framework am I going to use, and what platforms is it going to support, and what kind of tools are people going to use, and really, one goal here is to be able to have controllers have unique IDs. So you got an artificial life form, and it uses controller 2037, and so this artificial life comes to your process, your Java virtual machine, and it pulls down that controller from the internet somewhere. And I think you can do that in Java. Yeah, good, okay. All right. And then just from what I've read, I've read comparisons of Java and C++, and they look pretty comparable, so, just in terms of speed, from what I've seen. Maybe arguable. Oh yeah, we don't need to get into this, actually. So, all right. So my goal for this meeting was to be able to have two different environments and two different controllers, and to have each environment be able to support artificial life forms using either controller. And so these two different types of environments and the two different controllers are very similar, but and this is just an extremely simple simulation. Basically, what I have in each simulation, I have oscillators, and so. I'll just bring up the second environment for comparison. So basically an oscillator goes between one number and another, back and forth. So it might go between 0.5 and 1, with a certain step. It hits one extreme, it comes back to the other side. And so each of these artificial life forms, their fitness function is how well they can line up with that oscillator. So the closer they are to lining up with it, the more energy they get, and the more they're favored, and the more they get to reproduce. And so what we have here at the very top are the oscillators. The one on the left is the average of all the oscillators in the environment. So on the left hand, there's only one oscillator. It just goes back and forth, and the critters within it have to try to predict where it's going to go. The second one's a little trickier in that you got two different inputs, and you're really measured by the average. And each of these inputs becomes the input pins. So each critter gets to read input pins, it gets to write input pins, and it gets rewarded on how well it does. And the colors here indicate the controller type. And then there's a little code here which is basically, okay. So basically there's a randomly generated genotype, and the lowercase x's indicate gene sequences for eventual breeding. Right now, right now there's some occasional mutation that happens, but eventually they'll be breeding. And then the controller is responsible for taking that string, turning it into code. And then what these are the top organisms. So, okay, so initially it just starts out with random critters, and they actually very quickly get to the point where they're doing a pretty good job at anticipating the oscillators. And this is kind of interesting. Before we saw all blue, meaning all controller number 2, with its particular instruction set. For whatever reason, the controller number 1 has dominated here. Basically, controllers are virtual machines. So basically what's happening is every so often it looks to see how well the critters have done. It kills off the bottom 90%, and then it takes the top 10% and produces 90% more creatures, which may have mutated instruction sets. But that's just sort of a base kind of behavior that the environment could extend, and it could create a more kind of realistic way of reproduction. That's pretty much it.
It's an interesting parallel between your model of having an environment and a controller and your genetic code as separate units that you program and fit together with the model view controller architecture of web architecture. It's similar. Like the environment is much more active in yours. It does a lot more work than the view would, but that would be the correlation there.
Yeah, I've just definitely been inspired by a lot of other people's ideas and good design practices.
Also, it struck me you might look at OSGI because there's a way to load jar files in OSGI. There's a software program called Fish written in Java. So OSGI is just a specification for a way that you can load code and have it interact with each other. And each code publishes services. So your pins that go between the AI and the environment could be the services that are published by an environment. But you can load multiple environments in an OSGI framework and multiple, AI as well that would, they can interact with each other. Facilitated that way at the runtime, so you wouldn't have to restart and so on.
Thank you.
A couple more questions and then we'll...
Yeah.
What advantage do you see what kinds of problems do you see having multiple controllers lending themselves towards solving?
Well, one of the things that I love about the artificial life paradigm is that you just create your fitness function, and the solutions will evolve, right? So I mean, so some ideas that come to mind. They'll predict the next number in a sequence. Like it sounds really simple, but you could use it to generate music. You have a series of notes. You turn each note into a number, and then you have it. You train it on songs, and then you start feeding back the notes that it produces back into itself, and soon you have it improvising.
Why does this need multiple controllers?
Well, some controllers might be better suited to a job than others, but I mean, part of the problem, like, how do you know? How do you know which controller is gonna do the best?
I mean, could you achieve the same amount of variation by controlling the distribution of instructions in the instruction set? Don't use this one a lot, use this one occasionally, etc. You're sort of introducing another layer of complexity. I'm looking for the convincing, and the layer of complexity has a piece of the layer that's actually going to hit your performance. Because when you have a single controller, you can optimize things a lot to that controller. But if the controller itself is something that comes in, then it won't. So you have an interpreter over some data, and all behaviors can be achieved between changing the interpreter and changing the data. And you're saying, I want several interpreters, and so what does that buy you over just being richer in the data set?
In the data set
in the space of what the data can be in.
When you say, I mean, you're talking about the environment itself, or you're talking about the virtual machine?
I'm talking about the different virtual machines. So each controller is dealing with an instruction set that knows how to deal with.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is, so one thing I found is that sometimes sometimes adding a lot of instructions to an evolvable virtual machine is not an advantage. That basically, some instructions are much more useful. And so you can have two different kinds of virtual machines, one that uses 10 instructions, one that uses 20, and you can see which outperforms the other.
You could accomplish the same thing by limiting the probability that a particular instruction gets used in a mutation or in creating an initial genome. So you could have the machine that could handle all 20 instructions and set it up with probabilities of 0 on the weird ones or the undesirable ones, and then just run from there.
So I'll just say you might be right. I mean, that for me, there's just a level of experimentation that goes on when you have creatures involving an environment, and so for me, it's kind of about like, let's hedge our bets. Let's create an environment that could support. You create your simulation, and you don't have to marry it to a particular type of evolvable controller. You don't have to re-architect it to support something that someone else creates. It just appears one day, and maybe it does really well. Maybe it dies out. So
the creatures, in essence, the creatures have different sources. In this particular example, they are built by you, but I mean, they could come from...
Well, yes. So that's a model that says a creature is an object that supports a particular interface, and that's all that can be said about it. And that's perfectly lovely, but not weird. It's strange.
As time is moving rapidly toward 9:30, and I think we wanted to have Zan's discussion before we conclude, so we probably ought to do that now. But I really want to...
Can I just, one final thought on that is actually, if you look at these two screens, I mean, this might be part of the answer, which is on the left-hand side, you have a much simpler environment, and actually the simpler instruction set I've observed actually seems to dominate in that environment. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's more complex. Actually, the instruction set that's a little richer seems to do better. So you don't have to make that decision. It just, evolution just takes its course. So, but yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.